This is a segment that I'm very excited to be able to do. I have been following this story for a very long time because I myself am a former resident of Newburgh, New York. I grew up there. That is my hometown. I know all these locations very, very well. But just this week, a judge ordered the release of 3 of the Newburgh Four, which is a group arrested on terrorism charges back in May of 2009. Now, there was a film that was made about this called The Newburgh Sting that premiered on HBO in 2014. It was actually featured at the Tribeca Film Festival. I was lucky enough to attend the premiere screening because a friend of mine worked as a field producer on the film. And so HBO purchased this documentary in advance of the Tribeca Film Festival. That's how good it was. And I strongly recommend everybody see it. It is available on YouTube, but really nowhere else. It's not on HBO Max anymore. You can find it on YouTube if you just search in Newburgh Sting movie. But I will just summarize the facts of the case here before we get to their release. So an FBI informant named Shahed Hussein was sent to Newburgh, New York by the FBI to find terrorists. He was an FBI informant. He went to the local mosque in town. He flexed his immense wealth, gold chains, fancy shoes, luxury cars, and tried to ingratiate himself with some Muslim men at the mosque to see if he could get a little quote-unquote plot going. He was not there to infiltrate any ongoing suspicious activity. That's how the FBI always says it. Well, we don't create terrorist plots. We infiltrate ongoing terrorist plots and disrupt them. Nonsense. This guy was sent in cold, didn't know a soul at this mosque, knew nothing of anyone there. And he ended up ingratiating himself with one man, James Cromedy. Cromedy was a low-level drug dealer who served time on drug charges and was poor his entire life. Newburgh, New York, once again, where I grew up, is the poorest city in New York State, the most violent city per capita in New York State. In fact, it almost always cracks the top 10 poorest and most dangerous cities in the country. So this is a very, very desperate place and very desperate shape.
What was it like when you were growing up there?
Well, I grew up in the town, which was outside, but I went to school in the city, and I went to public schools, so we were all bussed in and bussed through. I spent a lot of time in these neighborhoods, and yeah, it is a very desperately poor, deindustrialized river city, as a lot of them are, north of Manhattan. Manhattan went through it a little bit, too, in the 60s and the 70s, right? It went bankrupt at one time. But a lot of these river cities up north, whether it's Poughkeepsie, Kingston, Newburgh, or even Albany, where I am now, they were hit very, very hard in that sort of mid-third of the 20th century. Newburgh had a big manufacturing base that never recovered once the manufacturing
like Rochester
left. Yeah, exactly. And so Cromedy was this low-level drug dealer. Like I said, he served time in the past. He was very, very poor his whole life. And Shahed Hussein, this FBI informant, asked him if he would like to make money serving Allah, right? And I'll explain why I know all this. He expressed interest, at which point Hussein started asking him about jihad. Now, he goaded Cromedy into assembling a team because there needed to be a conspiracy charge associated with this act. And if your co-conspirator is the FBI informant, then it's not a conspiracy. So he encouraged him to assemble a team to help carry out these terrorist acts, but Cromedy dragged his feet and at one point disappeared for several months. Now, this is all documented in the film. The film actually shows the actual conversations on surveillance FBI informant footage between Hussein, Cromedy, and later the rest of these 4 guys. So after Cromedy disappeared for several months, Hussein finally tracked him down months later, calling him on the phone and this time sweetening the deal. $250,000 he offered this man to do some jihad in the area. This is, of course, a life-changing amount of money for anybody. When you grow up as poor as these guys grew up, $250,000 is this otherworldly sum. Cromedy said, okay, you have my ear. He recruited 3 other men Onte Williams and David Williams. The third partner that they found was Laguerre Payan, who was a mentally ill, diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic living in essentially a halfway house. It was just a one-room row apartment at the time. But even then, the men were reluctant to go through with Hussein's plot. At one point, Hussein, the informant, gave Cromedy a camera. This was not featured in the documentary, but I happen to know this because I know some of the people who were victimized by this. Hussein gave him a camera to document targets, so they would have evidence. They're building a case. Cromedy took that camera and said, okay, I'll have the photos from you. He ended up selling that camera on the streets of Newburgh for $50 because he was a hustler. He was playing him. He thought this guy is this Indian guy, this Pakistani guy, whatever. You know, he's coming into our place with all this money. I'm going to work him, right? They were driving them around. They were paying for meals and all this stuff. So he was hustling the guy, obviously. And at one point in the film, you can clearly say when they are talking about shooting a missile at an airplane parked at the airport, one of the guys in the back says, well, how do we know that there aren't any people inside? They may be cleaning the plane or whatever. Yeah. We can't shoot at an airplane unless we know it's empty. He explicitly says on camera, and this was evidence in the trial, we're only interested in destroying property. We don't want to take any lives. They were very, very adamant about that the entire time. But slowly but surely, Hussein convinced these men to hit targets, including a synagogue in the Bronx and an airplane at Stewart Airport Base in Newburgh, New York. Now, they were arrested at the site of the synagogue because they planted what they thought were plastic explosives. They were fake, inert matter given to them by the informant himself, obviously, on May 20th, 2009. Now, when this went to trial, they were each offered a plea deal, which would come with a reduced sentence of 10 years with the possibility of getting out in 5. All 4 of these guys rejected that plea deal, insisting that they would not admit to being terrorists when, in fact, they were not. They were then found guilty by a jury. They lost the case, and they were sentenced to 25 years behind bars, each, which was the mandatory minimum sentence because a missile was involved. If a missile was not involved, they could have gotten off without much jail time if the judge deemed that they did not deserve such jail time. The reason this was a federal case is because Shahed took them across state lines to get what they thought were the weapons. Yeah. Right. This was completely concocted out of thin air. He did not infiltrate an ongoing plot. As you can see from what I'm saying, this was created by this FBI agent. But they lost the case, and they were sentenced to 25 years in jail each. Now, the reason I was able to tell you that whole story is because the surveillance footage became public info. It became public information because these guys did not take the plea. If they took the plea deal, that evidence, that video footage that was the basis for the documentary, which I sort of gave a crude summary of just now, would not have come to light, which means we would never have known the actual facts of this case. It was because they decided to fight and lose, unfortunately, that we now know all of this. But this week, 14 years later, a judge ordered these 4 men free. Now, because, as you can tell, I have some knowledge of this case that goes beyond what was even in the documentary film and what a lot of the media wrote about this case, I was able to vet a lot of the articles that were written in the past 24 to 48 hours since news broke. And I read the New York Times piece. I thought the New York Times piece was terrible. It left out a lot of key information, did not generate nearly the sense of outrage that it should have. I read a few other pieces. By far the best piece on this, and you talk about up is down, left is right, right? Who knows who to trust anymore? By far the best article about this was from the New York Post by Patrick Riley. So I just want to put this on the screen and give him his credit there and give credit to the New York Post for doing what I thought was by far the best write-up from what I've seen, because the New York Post has a lot of ads. I broke the article down into slides, so I'll read that right now about this court ruling. So if we look here, the article starts, 3 of the 4 Muslim converts convicted of a post-9/11 plot to bomb New York synagogues and shoot down planes were ordered to be released from prison by a judge who declared their 25-year sentences unduly harsh and unjust and blamed the FBI for radicalizing them. Ante Williams, David Williams, and Laguerre Payan, 3 of the 4 men who became known as the Newburgh Four, were granted their request for compassionate release by U.S. District Judge Colleen McMahon on Thursday. In her ruling, McMahon slammed the FBI sting operation that snared the men whom she wrote were hapless, easily manipulated, and penurious petty criminals that were set up by the feds and their unreliable informant. Listen to this statement. The real lead conspirator was the United States, McMahon wrote. God bless this judge, man. If you watch that movie as Russell did this past day, you would lose a whole lot of hope that there was anybody who was capable of getting this right in a high place. Very, very pointed words. We're going to go back to this article in a second, but one of the things Russell pointed out to me, because he watched the film at my recommendation last night, who was the head of the FBI at the time that these guys were rounded up and preyed upon? Who was the head of the FBI at the time?
Oh, Robert Mueller.
Oh, Robert Mueller.
Oh,
the hero,
Mueller.
the savior of democracy, Robert Mueller.
Yes, he was the guy who railroaded not only him. I thought this was one of the most interesting things in the movie, maybe the most interesting thing. At the end of the movie, they show that there are these other people who are all poor black people living in inner cities that were also set up and railroaded by the FBI. And they interview one woman in Newburgh after the sentence comes down. And she says, you know, you got to give us more to believe this, because it can't all be poor, black, uneducated people who are responsible, who are terrorists, basically. This is what they do. They purposely went after, there's my read, they don't say this, but they purposely went after people who could not fight back. When they decided they needed to generate cases to get headlines of how they're busting terrorists and also to justify their budget, to keep the money flowing, to keep the terrorist windfall coming into the FBI, into the agency, they went after the people who can't fight back. They went after poor black people. These prosecutions, the whole intention, the whole conception of them was completely racist. And this is a big part of how the racism in the justice system works. Like, if you want to look at a lot of the injustice in the criminal justice system, some of it is not racism per se in terms of I hate people of this race. A lot of it is, how do I make my career on the backs of people who can't fight back?
Of course. And how do you, and in this case, and they say this in the movie, the government just turns on its own people. Because at the time, this was the war on terror days, right? This is when the menace that everybody was supposed to fear was the Muslim terrorist, right? Now, what's the enemy that we're all supposed to fear? The white supremacist neo-Nazi, which is why they framed those 4 guys for trying to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor. This is the same thing. So when you see this stuff, it's amazing. They can make you look so guilty, and so much of the information reported about this case was a bald-faced lie, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But I just want to repeat that last line from the judge.
And those clips of Chuck Schumer, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was part
I don't think any of our audience has any respect to lose for Chuck Schumer. But if you did,
well, that was part of what radicalized me. I mean, this was 2014 when this movie came out, so this was before the Bernie campaign, it was before Trump, it was before all that. But seeing Chuck Schumer go on TV and defend this case as a model example of how the FBI is supposed to do their job, nauseating. That was a big eye-opener for me. Like I said, I was one of the first people ever to see this movie. I saw the first screening at the Tribeca Film Festival. So she says the real lead conspirator here was the United States. The article goes on. It was heinous of the men to agree to participate in which she called the government's made-for-TV move, she wrote, but added that the sentence was the product of a fictitious plot.
It's a typo.
Yeah, maybe it was a made-for-TV movie, yeah. But added that the sentence was the product of a fictitious plot to do things that these men had never remotely contemplated and that they were never going to happen. She blasted the government for using a, quote, villain of an informant, we'll talk about the informant soon, to troll among the poorest and weakest of men for terrorists who might prove susceptible to an offer of much-needed cash in exchange for committing a faux crime. McMahon slashed the three's 25-year mandatory minimum sentence to just time served plus 90 days. Don't forget, 25 years was the mandatory minimum for this quote-unquote crime. They were given the mandatory minimum because despite the guilty verdict, the judge presiding over that case obviously knew that justice had not been done, so they gave them the minimum time that they could have, right? They will be released in 3 months to give probation officers time to find suitable housing for Payan, who suffers from a mental disability. We are tremendously pleased that our clients are on their way home, even if it's 14 years too late, said Amit R. Gupta, part of a group of lawyers representing Payan and the Williamsons, who are not related. At the plea hearing, by the way, Payan did not plead guilty or not guilty. He did not have an answer. He was disoriented. He was confused. He didn't know where he was. At one point, his pants fell around his knees. I mean, this is a mentally sick person who was roped into this by just this utter low-life scumbag, Shahed Hussein, who we will know more about in just a few moments. Gupta described the three as destitute men, quote, entrapped for their race, religion, and working class backgrounds by a government looking to spread fear of Muslims and justify bloated budgets. The fourth man, James Cromedy, wasn't part of the compassionate release request, so he was the guy who Hussein originally went to and is expected to complete his prison sentence in 2030. So the three who were released were the three who Cromedy roped in at Hussein's request. But Cromedy's lawyer, Kerry Lawrence, told the AP that he intends to speak with him about pursuing similar actions. So hopefully he can get out as well. I'm confident he would be entitled to relief for the same reasons articulated by Judge McMahon for the other defendants, Lawrence said. The four were arrested on May 20th, 2009, and charged with plotting to bomb 2 Jewish synagogues in the Bronx and shoot missiles at military supply planes at Stewart International Airport. I was at a play rehearsal that night. They were arrested in the Bronx, but the homes of the families were raided in Newburgh that night. And I was at the theater. As soon as the play rehearsal got out, I went to make a left, which is the way I would have had to go to get home, and I couldn't. There was a squad car parked right at the corner where that theater was. There were choppers overhead. They made a huge, huge spectacle of it. But yeah, I remember that night very, very well.
Well, and you know, I mean, let's stop for a second and think about this.
Yeah.
14 fucking years. You know,
Yep.
you go around once, man. You go around this world once, even if you believe that you know, there's something after. Well, you know, it's not going to be this, right? Like, you get this once. 14 fucking years of these people's lives on a scheme. So it's just a scheme to frame these guys by one of the most powerful agencies in the government. It's just horrific to contemplate. I mean, imagine something like that happening to you, right? 14 years.
That means one out of every 6 days on this earth you spend in a cage. You can't get it back.
Yeah, well, especially the age they are, man. They're youth.
Right.
They lost their youth in a cage.
Yep. No, just absolutely unthinkable, absolutely horrible. But yeah, you're right. I mean, when you just think about that length of time, and once again, the FBI justifies these sting operations. They were very open about it. This was a sting operation. Anderson Cooper asks in the film, he says, so, as I understand, they went to purchase explosives and they ended up purchasing them from the FBI. No, first of all, they did not plan to purchase anything. They weren't willing to shell out any money. They had no money to shell out. These guys were piss poor.
They didn't have a car.
None of them had a car. None of them had any means to get around. They had nothing. It was the agent, it was the informant who went to them every step of the way, dragged them around. The guy disappeared on him for months. The guy was only interested in hustling him for lunch money. And this guy makes it look like he's a terrorist who was looking to buy explosives, and they ended up selling them to the FBI informant who did just such a noble job of infiltrating an ongoing plot. Complete lies. All of it. All of it. Absolute lies. Absolutely zero truth to any of it.
Well, and also they connected them to a mosque where Cromedy had been there 3 times, and that was it. He wasn't a member. And the guy they interviewed said if they had been members of the mosque, we would have told them to stay away from this guy.
Right.
Because they were, that was one of the points the film made that was interesting, that mosques were very, very careful about anyone who seemed suspicious and throwing them out. And he made the point, instead of treating us like an enemy, they should have worked with us, because you had people who did go on to commit terrorist attacks that were thrown out of mosques. For being suspicious. Right. So if the FBI was working with them, they could have said, hey, we have this guy. Right? The Boston Marathon bomber had been thrown out of a mosque.
Yep. Indeed. Instead, they go and infiltrate the mosque to try to create terrorist plots where there are none.
Right.
We read on. Prosecutors portrayed Cromedy as the ringleader of the chilling plot who recruited the other 3 and was loyal to a Pakistani terrorist group, though the government later decided not to present any evidence about foreign terrorist organizations at trial. The defendants had spent months scouting targets in the heavily Jewish Bronx neighborhood of Riverdale and securing what they thought were explosives and a surface-to-air missile aiming to shoot down planes, prosecutors argued. They were arrested while planting FBI-supplied fake bombs outside the Riverdale Temple and the Riverdale Jewish Center very, very early in the morning. I don't believe there was anybody in any of those buildings at the time, because they were very, very clear from the beginning that they were not willing to hurt any people. From the start, relatives said the 4 men were down on their luck and needed money. According to a 2014 HBO film, which I talked about earlier, about the case, Cromedy was a Walmart employee and a drug dealer. David Williams was a part-time student with a past drug rap who needed cash to get treatment for his brother's liver cancer. Payan, a Haitian immigrant, and Ante Williams, a drug dealer who had served time. None of the 4 men, all broke, even owned a car. They were promised a payment of $250,000 by FBI informant Shahid Hussein for a successful mission. All 4 men agreed to help under one condition: nobody gets hurt. David Williams said on FBI hidden video footage. That's the scene that I referenced in the film. It's on camera. That was presented at trial. That didn't sway these fucking idiot jurors this was the most open and shut entrapment case you could possibly think of. How they were found guilty in the first place is an indictment of the entire system, including the rank and file, i.e. people like us, not Russell and I, but the masses.
Yeah. Well, and then to lose an appeal.
To lose on appeal.
How? Like, when you look at this evidence, like, it's so clear that they were entrapped. I mean, everything in this case is the very definition of entrapment.
Yep. Literally the very definition of entrapment. There are some conditions that you have to satisfy to meet entrapment. This meets those. There had to have been no active plot. There had to have been resistance from the subject when you bring that plot to them. That's important, right? They had to have resisted at first, which these guys did. They disappeared on him for a number of months. Right. And number 3, they had to have not had the means to do the thing without help from the government, from the informant. This satisfies all 3 of those cases. Yep. Open and shut, slam dunk, black and white, no questions asked. Defense attorneys claim that Hussein riled up the men with rhetoric, chose the targets, and provided the bombs and missiles. The defense portrayed Hussein as a manipulator trying to please the government after his own legal troubles. He had been convicted of fraud for helping illegal aliens get driver's licenses and desperately trying to avoid deportation, had turned FBI informant in 2002. So just like with the mafia, right? Big Pussy, right? And the Soprano family, right? He gets in trouble and they say, hey, you could either go away for 20 years or you can go away for, 10 if you help us, rat on your friends, right? That's what they did here. They nail a guy and say, okay, you can either go to jail or you can help us catch other terrorists, right? Jurors deliberated for 8 days before convicting the men in 2010. 3 years later, they lost on appeal. This is the end of the article. Hussein also worked with the FBI on other stings, including one that targeted an Albany pizza shop owner and an imam and involved a loan using money from a fake missile purchase. Both men, who said they were tricked, were convicted of money laundering and conspiring to aid a terrorist group. Hussein was in the news again after one of his limo company's limousines crashed in upstate New York, killing 20 people in 2018. That made national news. It was a horrific limo crash up here in my neck of the woods, is where I live now, in which 20 people were killed. That limo had failed a safety inspection a month before the crash, and the slain driver didn't have a commercial license. Hussein's son, Nauman Hussein, who operated the company, was sentenced to 15 years in prison earlier this year for negligent homicide and manslaughter. Here's a report from Democracy Now! On that incident, just to get acquainted here with Shahed Hussein. So here is a photo of him. This is a screenshot from the movie. That's him hanging out in the mosque with the fancy suit and the Starbucks cup, you know, talking to a lot of just desperately poor people, drives his Mercedes onto the lot. Here's some...
And they also got into, this was kind of funny, that he owned some fucking, it must have been the most horrible motel in the world, because they showed a review where like all the reviews were 1-star terrible. Oh, yeah. and one line you can see from the review was, "You're better off sleeping in your car."
Don't stay here. Yeah, indeed. And then this is some other footage. So this is what we mean when we talk about this is from the movie. So obviously Shahed had surveillance footage set up in his home. He also had surveillance cameras on the dashboard of his car, because he was using that to build the case against these guys. And then that became evidence at the trial once these guys refused to take the plea deal. So there's some shots of the guys. Like I said, that is from the film. But then, oops, sorry. There we go. For some reason that froze on me. I will take that out of there. Here's a headline from when those guys were arrested. Daily News. Hate gang, bloodthirsty fours chilling mass murder plot. They're dumb but dedicated and very, very dangerous. This is what I mean. They can make you look
so fucking racist, man. Like I'm sorry. Step back for a second. Could you imagine the FBI like going to Scarsdale and doing this to a bunch of white people?
Of
like
course.
it would never happen. It would never happen. Not in a million fucking years.
Yep. Nope. Just absolutely horrible. But here is the Democracy Now! Report on Shahed Hussein's limo company after that horrific crash that killed 20 people. This is from 2018.
How a limousine crash that killed... We turn now to look at how a limousine crash that killed 20 people Saturday in upstate New York is linked to a man who is an FBI informant long accused of lying to the government and getting away with it. The crash in the town of Schoharie was the deadliest U.S. transportation disaster since 2009. The limousine had failed an inspection last month and was not licensed to be on the road. The New York Times reports that shortly before the crash, one of the victims sent a text message to a friend saying she was worried about the limo's condition. It has since been revealed the company that owned the car had a record of repeated safety violations. Earlier this year, it was issued written violations after vehicle inspections by the New York State Police and the Department of Transportation. On Wednesday, state officials arrested the operator of Prestige Limousine Chauffeur Service and charged him with criminally negligent homicide. He is Nauman Hussein, the son of a Pakistani immigrant named Malik Shahed Hussein, who is the company's owner and also an FBI informant.
In 2001, Malik Shahed Hussein was arrested for helping people cheat on driver's license tests. In exchange for avoiding deportation, he took a job as an FBI confidential informant, posing as a radical arms dealer in FBI sting operations. Hussein was a key figure in the FBI's case against the so-called Newburgh Four, four black Muslim men sentenced to 25-year prison terms after they were convicted for placing what they thought were bombs in a New York synagogue in 2010. Defense attorneys say the men were entrapped by Hussein.
So there you go. There you go. Just an absolutely horrible story. This is obviously a victory, 14 years too late. It is not the last you will hear about this case on our show. I happen to, like I said, have some contacts with some of the people who are more intimately involved with this, who can speak about this much more passionately and much more forcefully and with much more information than I can. And so we will be hearing from some of those people in the coming months as that release date nears.
Please clap.